Welcome to the channel Liturgy of Slaves. Emancipation promised freedom. Officially abolished by 1890, slavery led many to believe that freedom had finally arrived for millions of African Americans across the South. Yet in places like the Mississippi Delta in that very year, the reality was far more complex. On paper, freedom meant the right to own land, to work, and to live unchained. But the legacy of slavery lingered everywhere. Families who had once labored in the same cotton fields as enslaved people were now offered the chance to be free laborers. Yet they quickly discovered a system designed to hold them down. The land, the tools, and the markets were still controlled by local planters. With little choice, freedmen stayed and worked, often under contracts they could not fully understand or read. The promise of wages disappeared into endless deductions for rent, food, and clothing, trapping them in inescapable debt. This oppression was reinforced by fear. Men and women were warned that leaving the land would bring punishment, and entire families lived under constant intimidation. In the Mississippi Delta, where vast fields stretched to the horizon, the dream of liberty clashed with the harsh truth of economic bondage. Freedom existed in words, but daily life told a different story, one where debt and intimidation replaced slavery's old chains. Cotton remained the white gold. In the Mississippi Delta, cotton was more than a crop. It was the foundation of power and wealth. By 1890, this region produced millions of bales each year, feeding textile mills in Europe and the United States. Planters called it white gold, a treasure that preserved their fortunes even after the Civil War. Yet behind every bale stood the calloused hands and bent backs of freedmen who had little choice but to keep working. Landowners clung desperately to the plantation system. They knew their profits would collapse without cheap black labor. Instead of fair wages, they turned to sharecropping and debt peonage, ensuring black families remained tied to the land. The work was exhausting. Sunrise to sunset under blistering heat. Hands bleeding from prickly cotton bolls. Children worked alongside parents just to meet the daily quota. The cotton fields became prisons without walls. Planters used threats, intimidation, and sometimes outright violence to keep workers from leaving. Sheriff's deputies often sided with landowners, ensuring black laborers could not escape their contracts. For the wealthy white elite, cotton meant comfort, fine houses, and political power. For the freedmen, it was a reminder that slavery's shadow still hung heavy over the Delta. Cotton brought riches to a few, but it chained thousands of families to endless cycles of fear and poverty. Freedmen were tied to the land by sharecropping contracts. By the late 19th century, sharecropping had become the Delta's dominant system. At first, it seemed a compromise. Freedmen would work a section of land and share a portion of the cotton with the owner at harvest. In theory, this meant independence, but in practice, the contracts were traps. Most agreements were written by white landlords and county clerks, filled with legal terms that black workers, many never allowed to read or write, could not understand. The system was rigged from the start. Freedmen were forced to buy seeds, tools, and even food from the plantation store, also owned by the landlord. Prices were inflated, and credit came with crushing interest. At season's end, when cotton was sold, landowners claimed costs exceeded profits. The result, workers owed more than they earned. Families who dreamed of saving to buy land fell deeper into debt each year. Children and elders were pulled into the cycle, as every able hand was needed to meet quotas. For many, life felt no different from slavery, except the chains were now made of ink and paper. By 1890, the sharecropping system had locked thousands of black families into a life where leaving the land meant leaving everything behind with only debt to follow. Local sheriffs and judges often sided with planters, using vagrancy charges to force black workers back into the fields. The law was supposed to guarantee freedom, but in the 1890 Mississippi Delta, it became another tool of control. County sheriffs and local judges were closely tied to plantation owners through family, money, or politics. Together, they upheld laws that punished freedmen instead of protecting them. One of the most powerful weapons was the vagrancy charge. If a black man or woman was found away from the plantation without a signed labor contract, they could be arrested for being idle or without visible means of support. The punishment was a fine no freedman could afford. Those unable to pay were leased back to landowners or county work gangs, laboring under conditions often worse than slavery. This practice, known as convict leasing, maintained a steady stream of cheap labor. Courtrooms became theaters of injustice. Judges, almost always white and often former slaveholders, rarely ruled in favor of freedmen. Instead, they upheld the planter class's power. Sheriffs enforced the law with clubs, guns, and chains, ensuring fear spread across the black community. Even those wanting to leave the Delta in search of better lives risked arrest simply for walking the roads. The message was clear: freedom could exist only within boundaries set by white authorities. For many black families, the law was not a shield, but a weapon aimed directly at them, keeping them tied to the cotton fields and denying them the full rights of citizenship. Violence became a tool of control. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. In the 1890 Mississippi Delta, violence was never far from the lives of freedmen. When debts and contracts failed to keep workers in line, landowners and their allies turned to terror. Threats were whispered in the fields, warnings that anyone who tried to leave or refused to work would be punished. These warnings were not empty. Whipping, once the hallmark of slavery, continued under new disguises. Overseers carried clubs, guns, and whips, using them to remind workers of the power they held. Lynchings became the most brutal weapon. Across the Delta, black men accused of disobedience or simply walking away from a plantation could be hanged from trees. Their deaths were meant to strike fear into entire communities. Families knew that obedience and silence might be their only protection from violence that could erupt at any moment. Even the mere rumor of defiance could lead to deadly consequences. This culture of violence was supported by silence from white neighbors and often outright cooperation from sheriffs. The message was brutally clear: freedom was conditional, and anyone who challenged the system risked their life. For the freedmen, daily labor under the sun was already backbreaking, but the weight of constant fear made it heavier still. Children grew up learning that survival depended on submission, caution, and quiet resilience. Violence ensured the cotton fields remained full, not because people wanted to work, but because terror left them no choice. Freedmen. The desire to escape was natural. By 1890, many freedmen longed to leave the cotton fields behind, to search for their own land, or to find fair work in towns along the Mississippi River. Yet leaving was not simple. Landowners considered labor their property in all but name, and they often treated escape as a crime. Those who attempted to flee were hunted down like runaway slaves. Posses, sometimes made up of sheriff's deputies and sometimes organized by planters themselves, rode out on horseback to track down men and women who dared to leave. These groups carried dogs and rifles, following trails across muddy fields, through swamps, and along riverbanks. When they caught their targets, punishment was swift. Beatings, public humiliation, and sometimes imprisonment awaited those who tried to break free. The brutality extended beyond the individual. Families were threatened, wives were intimidated, and children were beaten to discourage further attempts. Escapes became rare, not because the desire for freedom had died, but because the cost was too high. This relentless pursuit reminded freedmen of slavery's past. Just as slave catchers once hunted human beings for profit, the 1890 Mississippi Delta revived the same cruel patterns. The difference was only in the system's name, not its spirit. Freedom was meant to mean dignity, choice, and movement. Instead, it became a cage without visible bars, where the threat of being hunted kept entire communities tied to the cotton fields they desperately wanted to leave behind. The Delta's cotton economy thrived on this hidden bondage, while politicians turned a blind eye to widespread abuse. By the closing years of the 19th century, the Mississippi Delta had become one of the world's richest cotton-producing regions. White planters built grand homes, sent their children to universities, and sat in powerful political positions, all financed by the endless labor of freedmen. The economy looked modern on the surface, but underneath, it was sustained by a hidden bondage that resembled slavery in every way but name. Local politicians, many landowners themselves, had no interest in reform. They depended on cotton profits to secure their influence. State leaders turned a blind eye to abuses, preferring to present the South as a land of progress and recovery after the Civil War. In reality, progress meant white elites regained their wealth, while black laborers remained voiceless, poor, and trapped. Even the federal government often ignored complaints as national politics shifted toward reconciliation between North and South. Black voices, especially those of freedmen in rural Mississippi, were silenced by intimidation at the ballot box. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright violence prevented them from voting, leaving them without any legal means to challenge the system. Meanwhile, the cotton economy flourished. Riverboats carried bales of white fiber down the Mississippi to New Orleans, where they were shipped overseas. Bankers and merchants in cities grew wealthy, but the freedmen who picked every bowl remained in rags. The region's prosperity stood as a cruel contradiction, an appearance of success built on a foundation of suffering. Families endured backbreaking labor from sunrise to sunset. Children and elders alike picked cotton under watchful eyes. Life in the Mississippi Delta's cotton fields was defined by exhaustion. From dawn's first light until sunset's fading glow, freedmen bent over rows of cotton, their fingers bleeding from sharp bowls. The work was relentless. Men, women, and even the youngest children carried sacks that dragged on the ground, filling them with as much cotton as their small hands could gather. Elders who should have been resting in their later years were forced back into the fields, their bodies breaking under the harvest's demands. Overseers enforced strict quotas. If families failed to pick enough cotton, their already meager share of profit would shrink further. This constant pressure drove entire households into the fields, working side by side in silence, broken only by the occasional cry of a child too tired to continue. Breaks were rare, meals were sparse, and water was often scarce under the blazing Delta sun. The atmosphere of surveillance was heavy. Watchful eyes, whether of landowners, overseers, or armed patrols, ensured no one rested too long or attempted to leave. The fields became open-air prisons where movement was allowed only within the boundaries of labor. For many children, the cotton fields became their school. Instead of learning to write or read, they learned to endure pain, to carry heavy loads, and to follow orders. Generations grew up with childhoods stolen by labor. The rhythm of daily life was shaped not by freedom, but by cotton's endless demand, which consumed the strength of both the old and the young. Churches and secret meetings became sanctuaries where freedmen prayed, organized, and dreamed of true independence. Amid the harsh realities of life in the Mississippi Delta, churches became more than places of worship. They were sanctuaries of hope and resistance. By 1890, small wooden chapels dotted the countryside, built by freedmen with their own hands, often on land hidden deep in the woods or donated. Inside these spaces, men, women, and children found relief from the crushing weight of the cotton fields. Hymns filled the air, and sermons reminded them they were children of God, deserving of dignity and freedom. But churches were not only about faith, they were also about survival. Secret meetings often followed Sunday services. Behind closed doors, families discussed strategies to resist exploitation, shared news about relatives who had managed to leave for Chicago or Memphis, and even pulled money to help the most desperate among them. These gatherings were dangerous. If planters or sheriffs discovered such organization, punishments could be severe. Yet the need for unity outweighed the risks. Prayer circles gave people strength to endure another week of labor. Spirituals sung in the fields carried hidden messages of longing for liberation and resilience. The church became a place where children learned not just scripture, but also pride in their heritage, something forbidden in slavery's days. For many, the vision of true independence was kept alive in these sacred spaces. Even facing oppression and violence, the church offered a glimpse of another world, one where community, faith, and freedom could one day triumph over bondage and fear. By the dawn of the 20th century, these injustices laid the foundation for the Great Migration as thousands fled north, seeking safety and dignity. The Mississippi Delta in 1890 was a place of deep suffering, but it was also a starting point for change. The endless cycles of debt, the violence of lynch mobs, and the weight of the cotton fields created a determination that would not fade. By the early 20th century, entire families began to make the bold decision to leave. This movement became known as the Great Migration. Word spread slowly at first. Stories of opportunities in northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis, where factories offered steady wages and schools welcomed black children. Letters traveled back to the Delta, written by those who had escaped, telling of freedom from overseers and the chance to live without constant fear. Though life in the North was not free from racism, it promised something the South never offered, the possibility of dignity. The journey was perilous. Families often left at night, carrying only what they could hold. They walked miles to train stations, rode wagons, or boarded riverboats heading north. Each departure was an act of defiance against the system that tried to hold them captive. By 1900, the first wave of migration had begun, and it would grow stronger in the decades that followed. The cotton fields lost thousands of laborers, but the legacy of their suffering traveled with them. The Great Migration was not just a search for jobs. It was a demand for justice. For the descendants of Delta freedmen, leaving was the ultimate act of reclaiming the freedom promised but denied since emancipation.